Hello everyone. On February 3, 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the British news agency Reuters released shocking statistics that startled many people. The United States had 500,000 troops in South Vietnam, had been fighting there for 13 years, and was spending $60 million a day, yet still could not hold a single inch of land in South Vietnam. That was surprising to outsiders. But for those directly involved, it was completely normal, because even America's brightest minds could not comprehend Vietnam's strategy. Four-star General Westmoreland and Chief of Intelligence Philip Davidson both assumed that the People's Army of Vietnam would attack before or after Tet. But they could never imagine an assault right on the Tet holiday itself. Even more, they predicted that the People's Army of Vietnam had no ability to strike cities, only to focus on places like Khe Sanh. That is why at the time, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was reduced by half, as many troops were allowed to return home for Tet. American generals were also out enjoying Vietnam's Lunar New Year festivities, and the South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu even went to his wife's hometown in My Tho to celebrate. To lure the enemy into complacency, on January 21, 1968, 10 days before the nationwide offensive, the People's Army of Vietnam opened fire at Khe Sanh as a diversion. This was also the first time they brought tanks into battle there. This reinforced the American belief that the People's Army of Vietnam would only attack Khe Sanh, while intelligence reports of planned urban attacks were dismissed as fake. As a result, troops in the cities were sent home. At that time, the U.S. prepared extensively for what they believed would be a conventional battle at Khe Sanh. They thought, if Vietnam had brought in tanks, surely they intended to line up and fight like at Dien Bien Phu. And in a conventional, set-piece battle like that, U.S. forces, highly trained and extremely professional, were confident Vietnam could never win. The U.S. even challenged the People's Army of Vietnam to attack there, confident they would crush Vietnam's main forces, since they had meticulously prepared. To the American mindset, Khe Sanh was like another Dien Bien Phu, except this time they believed they had learned from history. If in the past the French could only supply 100 tons a day at Dien Bien Phu, now with improved helicopters and aircraft, the U.S. could deliver up to 600 tons a day to Khe Sanh. So American soldiers had no worries: eat, pick up their rifles, and fight. In terms of firepower, the U.S. was just as well prepared. In the first 10 days of fighting, the U.S. fired 150.000 artillery rounds, 1.5 times the number of 105 mm shells the French had used during all 56 days at Dien Bien Phu. General Westmoreland even deployed the brand new Air Cavalry Division, trained and flown into Vietnam within 72 hours. As for bombers, B-52s crowded the skies over Khe Sanh like flies, dropping 100.000 tons of bombs. The U.S. believed the B-52 was their unbeatable advantage, recognized worldwide, but Vietnam proved to the U.S. and the world that B-52s were nothing more than flying scrap metal. With the tactic of holding the enemy by the belt, every night the People's Army of Vietnam dug trenches closer and closer to enemy lines for hand-to-hand combat. This completely neutralized the B-52s. The U.S. struggled so badly that they lowered the B-52 bombing altitude from 10.000 meters to 9.000 meters for accuracy. But since American and Vietnamese troops were so close together, any strike risked killing both. In fact, there were many times when B-52 bombs fell just 100 meters from U.S. positions. Khe Sanh was already soaked in blood when, on January 28, South Vietnamese troops discovered cassette tapes calling for a general uprising, realizing that the People's Army of Vietnam would attack during Tet itself. It was a disaster for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. On January 30, one day before the People's Army of Vietnam struck, they broadcast orders on the radio for soldiers to return to their units. But few obeyed. Most felt that in such perilous times, they needed to stay with their families. What if these were their final moments together? Others argued that even if they wanted to return, there was no transport, especially during Tet, when buses were not running. Because of this, every enemy headquarters in Saigon was easily attacked: the U.S. Embassy, Independence Palace, radio station, and National Police Headquarters. This event shocked the entire United States. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger later admitted that Hanoi had played bullfighting with America, luring the raging bull outside, then striking suddenly at its exposed core, leaving the U.S. command paralyzed. Even more shocking, after the attacks on U.S. command centers, a captured commando of the People's Army of Vietnam was executed by General Nguyen Ngoc Loan in the middle of a Saigon street. An image that horrified the world. That moment haunted global memory so deeply that even when Nguyen Ngoc Loan escaped to America, Democratic lawmakers Elizabeth Holtzman and Harold Sowers sued him as a war criminal and demanded his deportation. However, reports suggest the U.S. government, unwilling to reopen such an ugly chapter, had President Jimmy Carter personally intervened to let him stay. Nearly 20 years later, when Loan opened a pizza shop in Virginia, locals discovered his identity and fiercely protested, circling the restaurant and chanting. Some even scrawled, "We know who you are," on the restroom walls. These incidents helped fuel the global anti-war movement. Meanwhile, in Saigon, U.S. command centers were occupied for hours, shattering American morale at Khe Sanh. For U.S. soldiers, Khe Sanh felt like hell on earth. Death was looming over them. The situation was so dire that historian Michael McClear remarked, "The 6 o'clock news turned the war into a battle fought in every American living room." Such imagery created a shared realization that Khe Sanh was not a valley of freedom, but the greatest folly of a generation in power. That is why the United States was forced to sit at the negotiating table with the People's Army of Vietnam in Paris, where a battle of words unfolded between Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger. The talks dragged on for 4 years, 8 months, and 16 days, until the whole world exclaimed, "Why would heaven create Kissinger, and then also create Le Duc Tho?" All the developments of these negotiations will be covered in the next episode.